Dan found himself alone when the carnival arrived in town. Meanwhile, his friend Mike was out on a date with Candy Delaney. Originally, Candy planned for her sister Shannon to go with Dan, but Shannon backed out at the last minute and found her own date for the night. Dan was disappointed about that. He had a crush on Shannon, having known her for most of his life. They attended the same schools, although Shannon was always 2 grades ahead. Shannon was cute and had a great personality. She was the it girl of her grade, the quintessential blonde, curvy cheerleader who didn't act stuck up despite her popularity and beauty. Dan, Mike, and Candy had just graduated from high school and were getting ready for college. Candy was heading to Northern Illinois in DeKalb, while Dan and Mike were going to the University of Illinois at Chicago. They lived in the northwest suburbs of Chicago, making UIC a manageable commute, but NIU was a bit farther, so Candy would be staying on campus. Shannon was already attending NIU, being 2 years older than Candy. At the carnival, Dan kept looking for a chance to break away from Mike and Candy. He didn't want to feel like a fifth wheel and was feeling uncomfortable. Little did he know his chance was about to come. While they were waiting in line for ride tickets, Dan spotted Shannon running with Steve Rouse chasing after her. Dan called out to Mike, saying, "Let's go!" as he chased after them. They ended up behind a tent where they couldn't be seen by the crowd. By the time Dan caught up to them, Shannon was on the ground, holding her ankle and crying. Steve was hunched over, yelling at her. Dan grabbed Steve and pulled him back, causing him to fall. Steve got up and threw a punch at Dan. Dan looked around and realized he was on his own. Mike hadn't followed him in the chase. Steve and Dan were roughly the same size, but Steve was more muscular and a few years older. Dan threw a punch that missed Steve's face, throwing himself off balance. Steve pushed Dan as he fell into the muddy ground. Then happened the worst. Luckily for Dan, at that moment, a cop on a golf cart passed by, causing Steve to run off. Shannon crawled over to Dan to check how badly he was hurt. "Did I win?" Dan asked with a smile, sitting up in the mud. "No, I'd say it's a draw," Shannon replied. "How's your ankle?" "I think it's broken. I can't put any weight on it." Dan stood up and looked around. Seeing they were near the medical tent, he said, "Come on, I'll help you to the med tent." "Okay." He pulled her up, but as she tried to lean on him, she nearly fell. "We'll do this the easy way," he said, picking her up. He carried her easily the 100 or so yards to the medical tent. Inside, a cop was dealing with a drunk and an EMT was waiting for something to do. "What happened to you two?" the officer asked. Dan recognized him as a friend of his parents, Frank Brady. The EMT helped Shannon onto a table to check her ankle while Dan and Officer Brady talked. "Mr. Brady, she was attacked by her date and hurt her ankle running from him. I tried to help her out, but fortunately he took off," Dan explained. "What started it?" the officer asked Shannon. "He got mad that I wouldn't—" She paused, hesitant to say the words. "It's okay, I need to know," Officer Brady assured her. "I refused to give him BJ on the Ferris wheel. He had been drinking and becomes mean when drunk. After we got off the ride, he dragged me away and threatened me, saying I had to do it willingly or forcefully. There was no way I was going to comply, so I slapped him and ran off. I ended up behind the tents, and that's when Dan suddenly appeared just as Steve was yelling at me. I thought he was going to hit me, so did I," Dan explained. "Who's the guy?" Officer Brady asked. "Steve Rouse," Shannon replied. "Okay, because you're injured, I have to file a report. You both need to give a statement. How bad is it, Johnny?" "I don't think it's broken, but she'll need an x-ray. There's a lot of swelling, so we need to ice it first." "Okay, check out Lancelot and make sure his nose isn't broken." An ambulance took Shannon to the hospital while Dan received medical attention. He texted Candy to come to the medical tent so he could explain what happened and have her call her parents. As Dan was leaving the tent, Mike and Candy approached from the parking lot. "What happened?" Candy asked. "Your sister was trying to get away from her date, and I got involved. Long story short, she's on her way to the hospital with a hurt ankle, and her jerk of a date ran off," Dan explained. "Jesus," Mike muttered. "Yeah, seriously, I yelled for you to come when I chased after her. What happened?" "I didn't hear you, I'm sorry." "Well, I'm okay. I got lucky, though. He was about to beat me up." "I have to go to the hospital. My parents are meeting me there." "Can you drive me?" Candy asked, ending her call. "Yeah, of course," Mike replied, holding her hand as they walked to his car. "I'll catch up with you guys later," Dan said as he walked away. A couple of weeks later, Dan and Mike were hanging out by Dan's pool when Dan brought up the topic. "How are things going with Candy?" "Not much there, really. We went out a few times, but we didn't click as a couple," Mike replied. "Got it. Well, she's heading off to school soon anyway," Dan noted. "Yeah, her dad rented them an apartment out there. They might have already moved," Mike added. Ah, Dan said, with a hint of regret. He hadn't had a chance to check in on Shannon. Since Steve didn't hit Shannon, he got away with just a slap on the wrist for the fight with Dan. Steve was going to Alabama for school and left early, which Dan was relieved about. He wasn't looking for a rematch. The school year passed without much excitement, and during Christmas break, Dan ran into Candy at the mall. "Hey, Candy, how's everything?" Dan greeted her. "Good, just grabbing some last-minute gifts. How about you?" Candy replied. "Same here. How's school treating you?" "Challenging, but good. Shannon helps a lot. We're both accounting majors, so she can assist with classes since she's already taken them," Candy explained. "That's great. How's she doing? And how's the ankle?" Dan inquired. "Oh, she's fine. It's all healed up." "Is she around town?" Dan asked hopefully. "No, she actually reconnected with a guy she dated at school and went home with him for break," Candy informed him. "Oh," Dan responded sadly, and Candy noticed his disappointment. "Hey, Dan, want to grab some lunch?" Candy suggested. "Yeah, sure. How about Maggiano's?" Dan agreed. "Sounds good. I'll drive," Candy offered. "You like my sister, huh?" Candy asked as they waited for a table. "I guess," Dan answered sheepishly. "She's older than us. You know you don't have a chance with her," Candy remarked. "I never really thought about it that way. Anyway, I'm here with you, not her," Dan replied, making her smile. "When do you head back?" he asked. "The 7th. Classes start a bit later, but I want to settle in early," Candy explained. "Yeah, that makes sense. You know, it's just over an hour's drive from here," Candy added, making Dan wonder if she was hinting that distance wouldn't be an issue if they were interested in dating during the school year. "Yeah, do you come home on weekends?" Dan inquired. "I would if I had a reason to," she replied with a smile, just as their buzzer went off, signaling their table was ready. They enjoyed their meal together, chatting easily with no awkward moments. Dan found himself getting interested in her, noticing how flirty she was being. Dan insisted on paying for lunch, and as he settled the bill, he asked her, "How about catching a movie tomorrow night?" She hesitated for a moment before saying, "I actually have plans with Mike. It's just something to do. We didn't really click when we dated over the summer. I could cancel and we could go." "No, don't cancel on his account. We can do it another time," Dan replied, not wanting to complicate things between him, Candy, and his friend Mike. He realized he needed to talk to Mike to sort out any potential misunderstandings. As she dropped him off at his car, Dan said goodbye and received a kiss on the cheek. "Please call me, Dan. I'd like to see you again," she said. "Sure, see you around," Dan replied. "Dude, you're seeing Candy again?" Dan asked his friend. "Yeah, she's hot." "Obviously, but didn't you say you two didn't click?" "We don't need to click if I can get her into bed. We almost did last time, but my parents came home and ruined it. After that, she went off to school. How'd you find out about that?" "I ran into her at the mall. We had lunch, and I asked her out for tomorrow. She said she's seeing you." "I didn't know you were interested. It's just one date. You can have your turn after. I'm not falling in love or anything." "Yeah, whatever. Just a casual thing, huh?" "Hey man, if she's up for it, I'm game." Dan took his younger sister Angie and a few of her friends to a movie. As they waited for it to begin, he noticed Mike and Candy sitting 2 rows ahead. Angie noticed Dan's expression and asked, "What's wrong, bro? Do you like that girl?" "What?" Dan replied, a bit distracted. "You seem sad and you keep looking at Mike's date." "I do like her. I actually asked her out for tonight, but she was already going with him. She mentioned she wasn't really into him and thought about canceling, but I told her she shouldn't." "That was stupid," Angie remarked, just as Mike and Candy began to kiss. "Well, she seems somewhat interested in him," Angie observed. "Yeah, maybe," Dan conceded. The movie itself was enjoyable, but Mike and Candy were too busy kissing to notice any of it. As the movie ended, and everyone stood to leave, Candy caught Dan's gaze. She looked a bit embarrassed, but didn't speak. Mike, catching Dan's eye, cheekily gave him a thumbs up without Candy seeing. Angie then said, "Well, you've got one up on him tonight." "How's that?" Dan asked. "You've got 3 hot girls with you. He just has her." The other girls giggled at that. Dan laughed and said, "As great as that sounds, sis, a partying with 16-year-olds isn't my thing." One of her friends said, "Too bad," making them all laugh as they walked out. Dan didn't reach out to Candy for the rest of their break. He didn't want to interfere between her and Mike, especially after Mike told him they had been intimate and planned to continue seeing each other through the break. The day Candy was heading back to school, she called Dan. "Dan, why didn't you call me?" "First of all, you misled me about how you felt about Mike." "I did not. The way you were all over him at the movie theater suggests otherwise. And what happened in the car and at his place says the same. He told you all of that? Yeah, he knew I was interested in you. I guess he warned me either to back off or to steer clear of someone who gets physical when they're not really into a guy. I'm glad he did, especially since you spent the whole break with him. That's a lot for someone you didn't feel a connection with. Dan, that's... She tried to explain, but Dan interrupted. No need to explain. We weren't dating. You were free to see whoever you wanted. Dan, I really like you. Can we please go out sometime? It's not what you think. No, I don't think so. I liked you too. But either you weren't honest about your feelings for Mike or things moved too fast for me, if you catch my drift. Are you calling me a 403? Not at all. I'm just not into casual stuff. I'm looking for something more meaningful. She sniffled, holding back tears. Look, I gotta run. Have a safe trip back to school. Say hi to Shannon for me. She hung up without another word. Dan immediately regretted the conversation. He knew he shouldn't have said those things, but her boldness had really gotten to him. The next day, Dan received a text from an unknown number. My sister is an idiot, Lancelot. Recognizing it was Shannon, he replied, No, she's just the wrong sister. Instantly regretting sending that message, Dan knew he didn't want Shannon to know he had feelings for her while she was dating someone else. Her response was a simple frowning emoji. During spring break, Dan and Mike were having lunch at the mall when Shannon and Candy walked up to them. Mike didn't have time to react before Candy slapped him so hard she thought she'd broken her hand. You lying jerk! You told him I gave you a BJ and slept with you? You knew he liked me, you piece of crap. You even lied to him about seeing me over break. I went on one date with you, a-hole. Dan was stunned. He saw Shannon nodding behind Candy, confirming her accusations. He looked at Mike, who remained silent. Mike, Dan said, hoping for an explanation, I wanted a fair chance with her. I knew you wouldn't pursue her if you thought she was easy. I told you that stuff so I could have a shot before you two got together. Dude, you're supposed to be my best friend. Why would you do that? Bro, it's bros before hoes. I figured you'd find someone else. It's not like she's going to marry either of us. God, you're unbelievable, Candy said as she turned and walked away. Shannon urged Dan. Call her, Dan. You still have a chance. She likes you. It's all I hear about at school. Fine, Mike. I need you to get away from me right now. I'm furious with you, Dan said, standing up and leaving. Mike shook his head in disbelief as Dan walked away. Dan phoned Candy but got her voicemail. He left a message apologizing for being harsh in their last conversation. He wondered why she didn't inform him about Mike's lies, speculating she thought he'd trust his best friend over her. Dan ended the message, asking her to call him back. Candy didn't return his call, but a week after they returned to school, Shannon texted him. Don't give up. She still talks about you a lot. Dan replied, Does she date at school? No. Okay, thank you. Over the next few weeks, Dan called Candy several more times, but she never responded. One Saturday morning, he decided to drive to DeKalb to see her. What's your address? Dan texted Shannon. I want to send her some flowers. Oh, I hope that works, she replied, sending him the address. Dan easily found the apartment and noticed Candy's car parked outside. He had brought flowers and a stuffed animal, hoping she would talk to him. Candy was preparing lunch and Shannon was studying when the doorbell rang. Who could that be? Candy asked. Assuming it was the flowers, Shannon said, It's probably for you. Unsure, Candy opened the door and was surprised to see Dan standing there with flowers. Dan, what are you doing here? She exclaimed. Shannon smiled and said, I'll leave you two alone. Dan asked, Can I come in? Taking the flowers and Bear, Candy hesitated before saying, Okay, in here, pointing to the kitchen. He sat down while she finished making her salad. He had hoped for a warmer welcome, but at least she allowed him inside. Candy, he began, why haven't you returned my calls? Even if it's just to tell me to go away. I don't know. I'm pretty upset with you for calling me names, especially when I didn't sleep with him. I admit I was harsh, but I didn't mean to insult you. I just meant I'm not interested in anything casual. If we're together, I want it to be serious, not just a short-term thing. It's disappointing, Dan, because I genuinely thought we had a connection. So did I. That's why I'm making an effort now. Yeah? Why's that? I haven't shown any interest. Well, your sister has been pushing me behind your back. She encouraged me to keep trying. She chuckled, saying, I guess I can't even trust my own sister. Can we go to a movie on Friday? I really want to take you out. Okay, you win. But are you sure about doing a long-distance thing? She asked with a smile. It's only an hour's drive. I think you're worth it. Before she could respond, Shannon walked in. So, are you two finally getting together? Yeah, thanks for telling him not to give up, Candy said. Hey, I'm just tired of consoling you over him, Shannon teased. Bitch, Candy replied playfully. They started dating and everything went smoothly for a few months. They spent most days together during summer break when they weren't working. One Friday, they were supposed to go to a movie when Candy insisted on driving. Dan noticed they were heading in the opposite direction of the movie theater and asked, "Where are we going?" "To watch a movie." "Where?" "My apartment." "Why?" "Because my sister is at my parents', and I want to take our relationship to the next level." He smiled and said, "I like the way you think." Once they entered her apartment, Candy didn't bother with pretending about watching a movie. She pulled him straight into her bedroom. "Was I okay?" Dan asked quietly. "You were amazing. I really mean it." "That was my first time." "Dan, I had no idea. I would have done something special for you." "Well, guys don't usually brag about that sort of thing. Trust me, it was special enough. I love you, Candy. I love you too." Over the next couple of years, life continued as they dated and eventually got engaged, planning to marry after graduation. Shannon had married her boyfriend the previous summer, settling in their hometown. Dan and Mike remained best friends. Though there was tension after their argument, they eventually patched things up. Surprisingly, Candy warmed up to Mike, who would be Dan's best man at the wedding. A week after graduation, Dan and Candy moved into an apartment together, both working in their hometown. It was just a mile away from Shannon and her husband Aaron's place. One boring Tuesday night, their door buzzer startled them. Dan called through the intercom. "Who is it?" "It's Shannon, help me please," came the urgent reply. Dan dashed out without waiting, running down the stairs. "Shannon, oh my God!" he exclaimed, seeing her with a bleeding lip, puffy cheek, and holding her left arm. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Candy rushed up and embraced her. "What happened, sis?" "I caught him cheating and tried to kick him out. He laughed at me, so I started hitting him. When he tried to stop me, I lost my balance and fell down the stairs." Candy comforted Shannon for a few minutes before saying, "We need to get you to the emergency room. Your arm looks broken." "It's not his fault. I was hitting him," Shannon insisted. "Okay, we'll deal with that later. Dan, please get the car," Candy said urgently. But when she turned to look for him, he was gone. "He was just here," Shannon said tearfully. "Damn it. He better not be heading to your place," Candy muttered to herself. "Wait here. I'll get my keys." Meanwhile, Dan was fuming as he drove the short distance to Shannon's house. He pulled up, ran to the door, and found it unlocked. Without hesitation, he barged in and headed upstairs. "Good thing you came back," a voice taunted from above. Dan quietly ascended the stairs, hoping to catch Aaron off guard, but luck wasn't on his side. "Oh, it's you. What the heck do you want? Did Shannon come over lying about what happened? She fell. I didn't hit her," Aaron snapped. Dan remained silent, entering the bedroom and delivering a hard punch to Aaron. In a movie, that might have knocked Aaron out cold. Unfortunately, real life wasn't so forgiving. Aaron fell back onto the bed, but quickly sprung up to tackle Dan. They wrestled around the room, exchanging blows until Dan managed to wind Aaron with a punch to the stomach. Standing over Aaron, Dan remembered a similar move that had worked in his fight with Steve. Funny, he thought, realizing both fights stemmed from issues with Shannon. Candy rushed into the room, screaming at Dan to stop. Dan, surprised to see his wife, turned to find her in tears. "He's not worth it. Don't get yourself in trouble because of him," Candy pleaded. "Screw you, witch. You weren't saying that when I was with you last night," Aaron spat. "No!" Candy yelled. "He's lying, baby. Don't listen to him." "Oh, yeah, 403. Here, look for yourself," Aaron taunted, handing Dan his phone. Candy tried to snatch the phone, but Dan, in shock, kept it away from her. She collapsed in tears, pleading, "No, please, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Shannon entered the room, asking, "What's going on?" Still holding her injured arm. "Let's get you to the ER. We can sort this out on the way," Dan said, focused on helping Shannon. "No, baby, don't leave, wait," Candy cried out. Ignoring her pleas, Dan assisted Shannon out of the house. "Dan, tell me what happened in there," Shannon asked. "Your husband told me he slept with Candy last night. I worked late and went out for drinks, so I'm not sure if she was home," Dan replied. "I found panties under the bed tonight that aren't mine. That's how I caught him. I don't know if they're hers or not. I was at Mom and Dad's," Shannon explained. "He gave me his phone and said there's proof on there. I haven't looked yet. I'm afraid to." "What if it's true?" Dan said, tears welling up. "I love her so much." Dan, the pair of panties I found was a red lace thong, Shannon said. She has some like that. Let's wait until we get you taken care of. We can go through the phone together later, Dan suggested. Okay. Dan held the phone, anxiously waiting for news about Shannon. He tried to unlock it, but it was passcode protected. A nurse called his name. You can come back now, she said. As he stood up, he saw Candy running up to the entrance. He shook his head and followed the nurse. Well, you look like you lost the fight, Dan teased Shannon as he approached her bed. How many stairs did you bounce your face on? He joked, trying to lighten the mood. Her arm was in a sling and her face showed bruising. They said it's broken. I'll get an x-ray tonight and a cast tomorrow, I guess. Did you look at the phone? I just can't believe she would do this. He must be lying, Shannon said. It's passcode protected. I couldn't get in, Dan explained. Try 117711, Shannon suggested. Dan entered the code. I'm in. He opened the Messages app and searched for recent texts. He found a chain with the initials CD, which he assumed was Candy. There were only 4 texts. Dan figured Aaron regularly deleted messages. CD. He won't be home after work. Aaron. She went to your parents. CD. I'm leaving now. Be ready. Aaron. I'm always ready for you. Tears streamed down Dan's face as he read the last line. Your parents. It could only be Candy. He tapped on the CD icon to check the contact details. It turned out to be Candy's number. Handing the phone to Shannon, Dan sat down, deep in thought. Shannon started scrolling through Aaron's pictures and stumbled upon several videos of him having closeness. It seemed like 2 different women were involved, and one of them was definitely Candy. Damn, there's a video, Shannon exclaimed as she texted it to herself and Dan. There are 4 of these, but only one with Candy. I don't recognize the other woman, she sobbed. How could she do this to us? My own sister? My husband? I don't know. I'm sorry, Shannon. I never saw this coming. It's completely shocking. She never gave me a reason to think she'd cheat on me. If it was just once, could you forgive her? Shannon asked. Honestly, if it were anyone but your husband, maybe. But betraying you like this is too much, Dan admitted. Shannon set the phone down and took Dan's hand. I love you, Lancelot. I love you too, but why Lancelot? Dan wondered. Remember when you rescued me from Steve? The policeman called you Lancelot because you were trying to be my knight in shining armor. You've always been there for me when I needed you. You're my knight, my Lancelot, Shannon explained. Laughing softly, Dan replied, I forgot about that. Well, Lady Guinevere, should I call your parents? Yeah, I'll have to stay with them once they discharge me, Shannon said. Okay, I'll call them, Dan agreed. As Dan made the call, the police arrived to speak with Shannon. The hospital policy required them to be notified in cases of suspected spousal or child offense, and Shannon had the option to speak with them. Dan went out to the lobby to make the call in privacy. He found a spot where Candy couldn't see him, though he could see her if he peeked around a corner. Sitting alone in a corner, tears streaming down her face, Candy watched the main entrance of the ER. Dan still couldn't believe she had done this to him, to her own sister. His initial shock was giving way to anger. He called Shannon's parents and introduced himself. Hi, it's Dan. Hi, Dan. What's going on? Her father asked. Shannon got into a fight with Aaron and she's in the ER. What? Her father exclaimed. Is she all right? She fell down the stairs after he pushed her. She's pretty bruised up and has a broken arm. She's in ER room 112A. I'm gonna end that a-hole. I got a few hits in when I found out. Listen, it gets worse. How could it possibly be worse? He was having an affair with Candy? What, my Candy? Yes, he recorded it and showed me the videos. Jesus, where is she? She's in the ER waiting room. They were told not to let her in. Okay, we're on our way. I'll stay with Shannon until you get here. Right now, she's talking to the cops. I'm not sure if she'll press charges or not. Initially, she said it wasn't his fault before she knew it was Candy. Now that she knows, she might press charges. Honestly, I think he deserves to go to jail. I agree, Dan. See you soon. Dan passed the police officers on his way back to the room. They stopped him and asked if he knew anything, but he denied it, and they moved on. He didn't want them to know about his altercation with Aaron. Hey, your parents are on their way. Are you okay? Yeah, they'll be here soon to take me for an x-ray. How did it go with the police? I told them everything, that he pushed me away to stop me from hitting him, and I fell. They're going to arrest him. Good. He was way too arrogant about all of this. How could I have misjudged him so badly, Dan? Don't blame yourself for that. I'm going to divorce him. Good. You deserve someone better. She didn't respond and forced a smile. As the orderly escorted her out, Dan returned to the waiting area. He peeked around the corner and spotted Candy and her parents in a heated discussion. Dan took out his phone, found the video Aaron had made of their encounter, and sent it to Candy. He watched as Candy's phone buzzed with the notification. She opened it and let out a scream. Sitting down, she dropped her phone. Her mother picked it up, looked at the screen, and threw it back in Candy's lap before walking away, shaking her head. Candy noticed Dan peeking around the corner and grabbed her husband. They walked towards Dan's area, making sure Candy wasn't watching when they turned the corner. "What a mess, Dan! We're so sorry," her father said. "I'm calling off the wedding. I can't marry someone who would cheat on me and betray her family like that. It's unbelievable." "Did she give you any explanation?" "Not yet. I haven't answered any of her calls." "She was denying everything until you sent her the video." "Typical. Lie until the bitter end." "How is Candy holding up?" "She's in X-ray right now. I'm going to leave before she gets back. I'll grab some things and head to my parents' house." "Good plan. It's best to avoid her until you're calmer and settled." Dan entered the apartment feeling a wave of sadness wash over him. Ignoring his incessantly ringing phone, he packed a bag. He noticed a stack of wedding invitations and ripped one into pieces, leaving them scattered on her pillow. Candy sat in the waiting area, overwhelmed by how everything had gone so wrong. Why did Aaron record them? Why didn't he tell her? Why did he give it to Dan? How could she have been so foolish? Then she noticed a policewoman approaching. She walked up to her and asked, "Officer, is it illegal for someone to record me having closeness without my knowledge?" "Well, it depends on what they do with the video. Revenge XX movie laws make it illegal to post it online or share it on social media. There are also laws against blackmail and similar actions." "What happened?" "A man I slept with secretly recorded us with his phone and showed it to my fiancé." Illinois hasn't passed a specific law on that yet. You might want to consult with a lawyer to see if you can file a civil lawsuit against him. "I'm sorry about what happened. I hope things work out for you," the officer replied sincerely before walking away. Candy saw the doors open and her parents walking out with Shannon. She stood up and approached them, but her father said sternly, "Haven't you caused enough trouble? Just leave her alone." "But Daddy, please." "Don't make a scene, Candy. Just go home." "Where's Dan?" "He left an hour ago." "What? Damn it, he must be at home," she exclaimed before rushing out to her car to go home. As her parents turned onto Shannon Street, they saw a police car pass them with Aaron inside. Shannon sighed sadly at the state of her life. They packed a bag of her clothes, and Shannon picked up the red underwear that had caused the breakdown of her marriage and strained her relationship with her sister. "Mom, these belong to Candy. Could you please make sure she gets them? I want them out of my house." "Don't be rude. Just throw them away." Candy rushed into her apartment calling out for Dan. She checked every room, but they were all empty, and finally ended up in her bedroom. Sitting on her bed, she burst into tears. After a few minutes, she lay down and found the torn invitation. Sobbing harder, she tried calling Dan again, but he didn't pick up. The next day, Dan realized he hadn't watched the video. Shannon confirmed it was Candy, but Dan needed to see for himself. He decided to look at photos first, to check if there were signs it happened more than once. There were pictures of naked women, but none were Candy. He saw photos of Shannon too, but closed them to respect her privacy. Returning to the video, he pressed play. He saw Aaron mention getting a text from Shannon and setting down the phone on the nightstand. Dan realized Candy probably didn't know she was being recorded, and Aaron used that as an excuse. The scene was straightforward. Aaron wasn't even bigger than Dan. He was more muscular and maybe better looking, but Dan wondered why Candy would risk it. They barely spoke, didn't insult Dan or Shannon, and it was over in 10 minutes. Afterwards, Candy said, "That's it. Are you satisfied now?" "Yes, you're amazing in bed. Just don't let Dan or Shannon find out or you'll regret it." "Relax, I won't tell. This is our secret." "He better not find out about Mike." "I promised I won't tell him. Just be more careful if you're going to cheat. Going to a motel in broad daylight was stupid." "I'm done anyway. That was a goodbye. I won't cheat once I'm married." "You've got a twisted sense of right and wrong." "No, I'm committed once I'm married. We didn't vow anything when we were dating or engaged." "Wow. If you don't think it's wrong, why hide it?" "He doesn't need to know. That's all that matters. Bye." The video ended with Aaron smiling at the camera. Dan threw the phone against the wall and yelled, "Damn it!" His mom rushed in, asking, "What's wrong? Is everything okay?" "Nope. Just found out she's been with Mike, too." "Oh, Dan, I'm so sorry." "Yeah, me too, Mom. Me too." Dan kept ignoring Candy's calls. He had to deal with Mike and didn't want him to suspect anything. Hopefully, Candy hadn't watched the whole video and figured out that Dan was aware. Dan texted Mike, "Want to grab a drink tonight? Let's talk about the bachelor party." Mike replied, "Sure, Bill's at 7." Dan confirmed, "Perfect." Bill's Pub was a bar in a strip mall with parking on the side, a spot that was ideal for someone to get robbed. Dan called his high school friend Javi, calling in a favor owed. Back in sophomore year of high school, Dan and Javi caught Javi's girlfriend cheating behind the school. Javi fought the guy, while his girlfriend ran off and called the cops. Dan told the police that the guy had started it by insulting Javi. Javi got off with a fine and community service, less than the other guy who started the fight. Javi always said Dan saved him from worse trouble and promised to repay the favor someday. That day had finally arrived. Dan was waiting in the parking lot when Mike pulled up. Two masked men grabbed Mike as soon as he got out of his car. One took his wallet and punched him several times in the stomach and face. Then, to add insult, kicked him in the groin. When Mike curled up on the ground, Dan ran over, shouting at the attackers. The assailants fled, and Dan checked on Mike. "Are you okay? What the heck just happened?" "They took my wallet." "Damn. Do you need an ambulance?" "No, just call the cops." Dan called the police, and they filed a report for the robbery. Dan finally decided to answer Candy's repeated calls that night. "Hello?" "Dan, baby, it's not what you think." He interrupted her, asking, "How long have you been with Mike?" "Dan, I haven't. That's crazy." "Watch the video. We're finished. I'll pack my stuff. You can keep the apartment." "No, Dan, please wait." But the line was dead. Candy watched the video in horror, seeing their conversation after closeness recorded. She broke down crying again. Then she realized she had evidence of Dan blackmailing her in his own words. "Let's see what the police say about that," she said to herself. Dan went to Shannon's house to check on her. Her mom let him in, hugged him, and apologized for Candy's actions. She thanked him for supporting Shannon once more. He went up to Shannon's old bedroom and found her lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. He noticed her new cast and asked, "Can I be the first to sign it?" She jumped up and hugged him, crying on his chest. "Why, Dan? How could she do this to us?" "I watched the whole video today. They talked about it. He blackmailed her. He caught her going into a motel with Mike." "Mike? Oh my God." "Yeah, I can't understand it. Have they been seeing each other all along? Was that fight at the mall staged? I don't know what to think." "Have you talked to her?" "Briefly. Enough for her to lie to me and for me to end it." "What will you do now, Shannon?" "Now that I'm done with doctors for a while, I'm going to see a divorce lawyer. The cheating alone was enough, but knowing he blackmailed her into it. And he pushed me down the stairs. I can't believe I blamed myself at first." "It's okay. He'll get what's coming to him now. Did you hear that Mike got beat up and robbed outside Bill's tonight?" "No, but he deserves it for messing around with Candy. Karma's a bitch." Dan smiled and nodded. "What's next for you, Dan?" "It's over between us, obviously. I feel bad for your parents since they helped with wedding costs. We won't get that money back. I guess I'll move back home and start over. Keep in touch, Dan. We can lean on each other for support. I know I'll definitely need it." "Of course. I'll probably need a shoulder to cry on, too. It feels like so much time and love wasted. Thank goodness we didn't get married yet. I regret ever advising you to keep trying with her." "It's all right. I was settling anyway. My first choice was already taken." Her face lit up and she smiled at his remark. He hugged her once more before heading downstairs. Her parents were chatting in the kitchen as he entered. "Mr. and Mrs. Delaney, I'm really sorry about the wedding. I'll reimburse you for the deposits you made." "So this is final then? You've made your decision?" "Yeah. Turns out she was also involved with my best friend." Her mom started crying while her dad said, "Don't worry about the money. She'll pay us back. She was unfaithful." "Gary!" her mom snapped. "Just calling it as it is. If she had been faithful, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Take care. You're both wonderful people. I've been grateful to be part of your family these past few years." A tear rolled down his cheek as he hugged them goodbye. "You never know what the future holds, Dan." "We'll see, Mrs. Delaney. Take care." A week later, Dan returned to his old apartment to gather his belongings. He waited until Candy left for work, then packed and loaded everything into a borrowed van. After closing the door for the last time, he took a final look around. He felt sadness for all that was lost. The love, the dreams, the children they would never have. Leaving the key on the kitchen table, he drove back to his parents' house. Mike called him, the first time since the incident at Bill's. "What?" he shouted into the speakerphone. "Dan, listen, it was all a lie. I never slept with Candy. Are you kidding me? Were you oblivious or just dumb? She was blackmailed because of you. She admitted it in the damn video. I'm sorry, man. I don't know what to say other than I'm really sorry. How long? What? For how long were you sleeping with her? About 2 months. It started at Camden's party. You passed out and the rest of us played Truth or Dare. Truth or Dare? You guys are college graduates, not middle schoolers. We were all drunk. Some of the dares included kissing, groping, and stripping. By the end, we were all really turned on. Candy and I were the only single ones left. When everyone else went off to have closeness with their partners, we were so wasted that we did it too. Dude, why did you keep going? It wasn't regular. She'd call me when she wanted it. You were my best friend, man. How could you do that to me? I've always wanted her. You know that. I finally had the chance and she was amazing in bed. How could I say no? Listen carefully. The next time I see you, those guys who robbed you will seem merciful. You're a dead man walking. When I find you, because I will, no one will recognize what's left of you. He didn't wait for a reply and ended the call. He scolded himself for being so dramatic. He knew he wasn't a fighter, and his last few fights hadn't ended well. It was an empty threat, but he hoped it would keep Mike away. Candy was devastated when her family cut off all contact with her. She eventually moved to an office in Milwaukee, hoping they would forgive her someday. She knew Dan never would. The betrayal hurt too much. Aaron was released on bail but stayed away from Shannon, partly because of the restraining order and partly because he wanted to be rid of what he called a clingy woman. He took plea deals for both pushing Shannon and blackmailing her. His lawyer tried to argue on the blackmail charge, but since the video was on his phone and he willingly showed it to Dan, the judge allowed it as evidence. He got 6 months for pushing Shannon and 1 year for blackmail. His lawyer negotiated the best deal he could, given the circumstances. Shannon's statement suggested her fall was nearly accidental, but the push leading to it was not. He didn't get off lightly. After serving 12 months with good behavior, he moved back to his hometown. Shannon never saw or heard from him again. Dan and Shannon met every Saturday morning for coffee and tea. It was purely platonic, a way for two hearts that had been hurt to find solace together. After 6 weeks, she called off their meeting one Saturday morning. She left a voicemail, tearfully explaining she wasn't feeling well. Dan didn't call her back. Instead, he drove to her house where she had moved back after Aaron left. His knock on the door startled her out of her melancholy on the couch. Used tissues were scattered around, and she was dressed in an old robe. Seeing Dan through the window, she gasped. She didn't want him to see her like this and shouted, "Please go. I'm okay." Dan shook his head and mouthed, "No." She broke down in tears and pleaded, "Please." Again, he shook his head, refusing to leave. Reluctantly, she opened the door. He entered, and seeing the state of the house, he hugged her immediately. "What happened? I'm supposed to be the one here for you, remember?" "I'm pregnant." "Oh, damn." "Yeah, oh, damn. Come on, let's sit down. I'll make you some tea." He went to the kitchen and got her a green teapot. She used a Keurig for her tea. It was easier than using a teapot. He brought her the tea and started cleaning up the tissues, throwing them away. Once they were settled, he sat beside her, pulling her into a comforting hug. She cried silently in his arms for 10 minutes. Finally, she spoke. "I'm almost 3 months pregnant. With all the stress, I didn't realize I missed my period." "Who's the father?" Dan joked and got a playful slap on the arm. "Asshole, of course. I'm not a cheater." "Of course not." "What am I going to do, Dan? I'm in deep trouble. In a few months, I'll be divorced, and my child will be born without a name. I've already decided I won't let Aaron know about the baby after what he did. I'm terrified. I want nothing to do with him. The first thing you're going to do is take a shower. Once you're refreshed, I'll take you to our regular cafe where we've been meeting every week for the past month or so. This isn't the end of the world for you. It's just the beginning. You're going to have a baby, a beautiful little person who will become a future president or doctor. I envy you so much. I can't raise a baby alone. Shannon, you're a wonderful woman. There's someone out there waiting for you, I'm sure of it." "Ha! Easy for you to say," she replied as she headed upstairs to shower. Dan heard her mutter, "Had the wrong sister," under her breath. While she showered, Dan tidied up her place. He cleared the clutter in the living room and loaded the dishwasher with the sink full of dishes. She came downstairs to find him wiping down the counters. "Why are you cleaning my house?" "Huh? I'm just straightening up." "Whatever, let's go." Sitting in the cafe, Dan ordered black coffee for himself and tea with non-fat milk for her. She smiled, appreciating his thoughtfulness in remembering her order. "What?" he asked, noticing her smile. "It's sweet how you remember my order." We've been doing this for a while now. I know, but if you didn't care, you wouldn't pay attention to little things like that. Of course I care. How many punches to the face do I have to take for you to realize that? She looked away, wiping a tear. Sorry, she said. I'm just emotional. You're pregnant. I guess I should get used to that being the new normal. Changing the subject from hormones. Have you told your parents yet? No, that scares me too. You know you have to before it becomes obvious, right? I know. I don't think they'll be upset. They really want to be grandparents. It's just that they've been dealing with a lot of stress lately. Both their daughters' marriages falling apart. Well, at least yours hasn't ended yet. Would you like me to come with you? Maybe I can help ease the tension? I can't ask you to do that. It's not your problem. You didn't ask. I offered, and it's no trouble. Right now, you're my best friend. I won't let you go through this alone. Best friend, she said with a raised eyebrow. He nodded and replied, Yeah, remember that. Shannon nervously knocked on her parents' door, hoping no one would answer. Her dad opened the door and she frowned. Hi, Dad. Oh no, I'm only Dad when something's wrong. Meg, Shannon and Dan are here. She called me Dad. What's going on now? Mrs. Delaney asked jokingly but half serious. Let's sit down, okay? Sure thing, Pumpkin. What's up? Her dad asked. I'm pregnant. What? Dan, couldn't you two have gotten married first? Her dad exclaimed. Dan was stunned, and Shannon quickly added, Dad, I wish. Dan's head snapped so fast his vision blurred. It's Aaron's. I've never even kissed Dan, let alone slept with him, she clarified. Oh, sorry, sweetie. You two are so close we just assumed you were dating, her dad said sadly. No, Dad. We're just supporting each other through our troubles as friends. I mean, she's still legally married. Good grief, is that the only thing holding you back? Dan, the papers are filed and it's all but over. Shannon's been through so much, her dad continued. Dan sat there speechless, mouth wide open. He couldn't find the words, so her dad pressed on. Dan, she's in love with you. We can all see it. Hell, we thought you two were already a couple. Dan, her mom added, I can see the way you look at her. There's love there. Dan took Shannon's hand and said, When we were younger, you never seemed interested in me. I thought you didn't feel the same. What? Shannon responded, surprised. I've loved you from a distance for years. Back in grade school and high school, it wouldn't have worked. But after I turned 18 and graduated, I thought I might have a chance. Candy even tried to help, but when you stood me up to go with Steve to the carnival, I thought you didn't like me that way. It broke my heart. Later, she told me it was because you were older and back with your boyfriend at school. Oh, Dan. She told me Mike's friend needed a date. She didn't say it was you. I probably would have said yes, even though you were younger. You were cute, and I knew you were a good guy. After you saved me from Steve, I was so embarrassed I just ran back to school. By the way, that boyfriend was Aaron. He talked me into giving him another chance. It feels like we've wasted a lot of time, Dan said, leaning in to kiss her. Well, that's settled, her dad interrupted. Now, about my future grandchild. How far along are you? Almost 3 months. We need to get your house ready. We have to set up a nursery, childproof everything, and go shopping. Oh, we're going to shop, her mom chimed in joyfully. Dan, if things are going where they seem to be going between you two, can you handle raising a child that isn't yours biologically? Her dad asked cautiously. Shannon gasped, surprised by the question. Dad? No, it's a fair question. I haven't had time to think about it, but I don't see why it would be a problem, especially since you don't want Aaron involved in the baby's life. Shannon burst into tears of happiness, saying, I love you, Dan. He kissed her again and replied, My dear, I love you more. Her mom clapped her hands and said, Let's start planning. A few weeks passed, and despite seeing each other a few times a week and talking on the phone daily, Dan realized they hadn't been on a proper date yet. He decided to send flowers to her office immediately and included a note. Would you like to see a movie on Friday? At 3 o'clock, he received a text saying, I wondered if you would ever ask me out. He responded in a clumsy way. I had to gather the courage to be seen in public with a woman who's pregnant. After hitting send, he instantly regretted his comment. She couldn't see his expression or understand it was a joke. Dan grabbed his coat and rushed out of his office. Since she worked a few miles away, he arrived quickly. He hurried past reception and found her cubicle. She hadn't noticed him approaching from behind. Startling her, he blurted out, It was just a joke. She spun around and burst into laughter. You came all the way here to tell me it was a joke? Silly, I knew that already. Seeing fear in his eyes and that they were red, she added, Oh God, did you really think I'd be upset? She stood up and hugged him. You're such an idiot. I knew you were joking. Sandy in the neighboring cube chimed in. She suddenly burst out laughing and showed us the dumbest text we've ever seen. You're either the dumbest guy alive or the luckiest. Dan grinned and replied, definitely the luckiest man alive. He kissed her and said, well, that's enough excitement for today. I'll let you all get back to work now so you can laugh at me in peace. Dan arrived at her doorstep on Friday evening dressed in his finest suit. Although their dinner reservation at Ruth's Chris Steakhouse didn't require formal attire, Dan wanted to make their first official date special. When she opened the door, she exclaimed, wow, you clean up nicely. Caught up in how stunning she looked, Dan was momentarily speechless. She wore a loose-fitting dress that gracefully draped over her baby bump, paired with mocha stockings that accentuated her legs. Her short blonde hair framed her face perfectly, and her makeup, though subtle, enhanced her natural beauty. The dress revealed just enough cleavage, and he noticed her red-painted toenails peeking out from ankle-strap heels. Well, damn, she teased. I can't tell which part of me has left you speechless. Care to guess? Dan smiled. Your baby bump, he replied playfully. She gasped, momentarily shocked, but then realized he was joking. Whatever, you pervert. You probably liked my feet, she teased back. Looking deeply into her eyes, Dan gently lifted her chin with his finger and said sincerely, as much as I appreciate your feet, I wasn't kidding about your baby bump. It's beautiful. I love you. She smiled, holding back tears, and whispered, I love you more. After their dinner date, Dan drove her home and walked her to her door. She turned to him and said, you know, if we make love, you don't need to wear a condom. Dan chuckled and replied, but I don't know where you've been. She playfully punched his shoulder. Dan, please come inside and make love to me. Leaning down to kiss her, Dan paused and said with a smile, I've been waiting to hear those words from you, but wait. Curious, she looked up at him and asked, what's wrong? First one to peek makes breakfast. Honey, you're talking about an incentive to not peek first. Dan woke up wrapped in the arms of the woman he loved, feeling like she was his soulmate and more content than ever before. Shortly after, she woke up and smiled upon seeing him watching her. What are you thinking, my love? She asked. Honestly? He replied. Yes, please. I was thinking about how in stories the lover wakes up to the smell of coffee and bacon. All I smell is closeness and morning breath. She playfully hit him and teased. Okay, I'll get the coffee and bacon started. There's an extra toothbrush in the left drawer. Thank you, he said, kissing her. I love you. When the time came, Dan started attending all of Shannon's doctor appointments and Lamaze classes. Everyone assumed he was the baby's father, and neither he nor Shannon corrected them. She was proud for people to think of Dan as the father. Pulling into his apartment's parking lot one day, Dan spotted Shannon sitting on his stoop. What's up, honey? He asked. She threw an envelope at him and said, my divorce is final. That's great, he said. What's wrong? I don't know. Nothing? Everything? I guess my failure as a wife is complete. How can you want me? I clearly wasn't enough for Aaron. Dan understood what she was going through. Shannon had been feeling insecure about her slight weight gain and had always worried he might change his mind about her, leaving her for someone who wasn't pregnant and could have their own child. Dan had been anticipating this day for months. He took her hand and led her inside his apartment. Opening the door, he ushered her in. Please sit. I'll be right back. He walked into his bedroom and dialed a number. Mr. Delaney, I'm sorry to do this over the phone, but Shannon received her final divorce papers today. She's really upset, sir. I'd like your blessing to marry her. Jesus Christ, son. You had it right with Candy, and now you've got it again. Make an honest woman out of her. Come over and show her mother the ring. I'm sure you've already got it. Yes, sir. Thank you. We'll be there soon. Hey, babe. Can you come in here for a minute? Dan called out. You're making your pregnant girlfriend walk all the way. Dan knelt on one knee as Shannon walked into the room. She stopped mid-sentence, tears streaming down her face. He expressed his heartfelt proposal, asking Shannon to marry him and to help create a better future for their child. Overcome with emotion, Shannon tearfully accepted his proposal. Dan sighed with relief, and Shannon playfully smacked his shoulder. They shared a passionate kiss, and Dan whispered, I've waited so long for this moment. Shannon murmured between kisses, what a futile use of time.